Jang Hyun-woo never imagined that the woman he just bound himself to in a multi-million-dollar contract would be the same person holding a silenced pistol to his chest only hours after saying, "I do." But that night in the dim, cold silence of his Seoul estate, the strategic alliance he built his future on vanished in a heartbeat. Lina Hart didn't look like the obedient bride the syndicate had promised. She stood in the center of his study, her black gown like a shadow, her eyes devoid of the warmth he'd expected from a stranger. She looked at the most feared man in Seoul not with fear, but with the icy precision of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. Hyun-woo stood frozen, his empire suddenly feeling like a cage. "Who are you really?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't even flinch. "I am the secret you weren't supposed to find," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "This marriage wasn't a peace treaty, Hyun-woo. It was an execution. Now step back, or I'll let the men outside finish what I started." He was a stranger in his own home, discarded by a woman who moved with the lethal grace of a ghost he didn't have time to react before the windows shattered. The flash of muzzle fire lit up the room. The scream of tires echoed from the driveway as his world erupted into chaos. And then, a deafening explosion and darkness. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to support the channel. My friend once told me stories like this, stories about power, betrayal, and unexpected love, would never find an audience. But I believe they deserve to be told. So if you're already hooked by what you've heard, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. And before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our stories reach people all over the world, and it's always amazing to see how far they travel. Nah. The crystal chandeliers of the Shilla Hotel ballroom didn't cast light so much as they cast shadows, long, jagged lines that stretched across a room filled with the most dangerous men in Seoul. This was not a wedding, it was a ceasefire. On the left side of the aisle sat the Jang syndicate, stone-faced men in sharp charcoal suits who kept their hands near their waistbands. On the right were the representatives of the Hart family, a foreign faction whose silent presence felt like an encroaching fog. At the center of it all stood Jang Hyun-woo. He looked every bit the ruthless sovereign he was, his black suit tailored with military precision, his expression as cold as the marble floors beneath his feet. To him, this ceremony was merely a signature on a blood-stained document. He didn't believe in love, only in leverage. The woman walking toward him was simply the newest piece on his chessboard, a human collateral meant to stop a war that had already claimed too many lives. When the heavy oak doors finally groaned open, a hush fell over the room that felt heavier than the music. Lina Hart stepped into the light. She was a vision of haunting, monochromatic elegance in a black lace gown that defied tradition. She didn't walk with the hesitant steps of a bride being sold into a den of lions. She moved with a rhythmic, measured grace that commanded the air around her. As she reached the altar, Hyun-woo tracked her every movement. He expected to see a flicker of fear in her eyes, a tremor in her hands, or the glassy look of a woman who had accepted a tragic fate. Instead, when she looked up at him, he found a gaze that was disturbingly level. Her dark eyes didn't just look at him. They looked through him, scanning his posture, his pulse point, and the exits behind him. The officiant's voice was a low drone reciting vows that neither of them heard and neither of them meant. "To honor and protect," the man said. Hyun-woo noticed the slight tilt of Lina's head as a waiter dropped a silver spoon in the back of the room. She didn't jump, but her pupils dilated, her body priming for a reaction before her mind could even process the sound. "I do," Hyun-woo said, his voice a gravelly baritone that felt like a threat. "I do," Lina replied. Her voice was soft, yet it carried an underlying resonance that made the hair on the back of Hyun-woo's neck stand up. As they signed the registry, their hands brushed. His skin was burning, hers was unnervingly cool. For a brief moment, the contract was sealed. The two most powerful factions in the underworld were now joined by a thread of silk and steel. But as Hyun-woo looked at his new wife under the flickering candlelight, a cold realization settled in his gut. He had married a stranger to secure his empire, but the way she watched the shadows made him wonder if he had just invited his greatest enemy through the front door. The wedding reception was a hollow display of opulence, a gilded cage meant to mask the scent of gunpowder and ancient feuds. By the time the last of the diplomats and foot soldiers had cleared the ballroom, the silence that fell over the Jang estate was more suffocating than the noise. Hyun-woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private quarters, watching the city lights of Seoul flicker like dying embers. Behind him, he heard the soft, rhythmic click of heels against the polished wood. Lina Hart entered his world not as a guest, but as a permanent fixture of his reality. She had discarded the heavy lace veil, revealing a face that was a masterpiece of controlled composure. As she moved through the room, she didn't look at the expensive art or the sprawling view of the skyline. Her eyes, dark and piercingly observant, moved across the corners of the ceiling, identifying the security cameras, and lingered on the heavy oak doors, calculating the weight of the locks. "Your tea," she said, her voice a smooth, low melody that broke the silence without shattering it. She placed a delicate porcelain cup on the desk beside him. Hyun-woo didn't touch it. In his world, a gift from a stranger was often a death sentence. He turned, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. "You move like someone who spent her life avoiding being seen, Lina, or someone who spent it hunting." Lina didn't flinch at the accusation. She walked to the opposite side of the room, her movements possessing a fluid, predatory grace that felt entirely out of place in a wedding gown. She stopped at the bookshelf, her fingers trailing over the spines of leather-bound volumes. "In my family, silence is the only thing that keeps you alive. You of all people should understand that, Jang Hyun-woo." He studied her, trying to find a crack in the porcelain mask. Most people trembled in his presence, others tried to flatter him. Lina did neither. She existed in a state of perpetual readiness, a coiled spring hidden behind silk and lace. She was a stranger he had bought to save his empire, yet as she turned to face him, her expression remained an unreadable map of secrets. "The alliance is signed," Hyun-woo stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "But don't mistake a contract for trust. I will be watching you." Lina offered a faint, enigmatic smile, a ghost of a gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "Then we have something in common," she replied softly, "because I never look away." She walked past him toward the sleeping quarters, leaving the scent of sandalwood and something metallic lingering in the air. As the door clicked shut, Hyun-woo realized with a jolt of adrenaline that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the most dangerous person in the room. He had invited a silent bride into his bed, but he had no idea if she was there to share his throne or to burn it to the ground. The following weeks were a masterclass in tension, a slow-burning fuse that refused to spark. Hyun-woo prided himself on being the most observant predator in Seoul, a man who survived by reading the microscopic shifts in the air before a strike. Yet, as he shared the vast, echoing spaces of the Jang estate with Lina, he realized he was being watched with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. It began with the small things, the way she never sat with her back to a door, or how she could identify the weight of a footstep in the hallway long before his most seasoned bodyguards reached the threshold. One evening, while they sat in a heavy, forced silence during dinner, a distant car backfired on the street far below the hillside villa. While Hyun-woo merely paused his glass of wine, he saw Lina's hand hover an inch above the table, her fingers tensing in a way that suggested she wasn't startled, but ready to draw a weapon that wasn't there. Later that night, he found her standing on the balcony, her black silk robe billowing in the cold wind. She wasn't looking at the stars or the glittering city. Her gaze was fixed on the perimeter fence, specifically the blind spot near the western gate, where the security cameras lagged by a fraction of a second during their rotation. "The third guard on the night shift has a limp," she said, her voice barely a whisper, though she didn't turn to look at Hyun-woo as he approached. "It slows his patrol by 45 seconds every hour. You should move the sensor closer to the tree line." Hyun-woo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had spent millions on that security system, yet this woman, a stranger he had supposedly rescued from a crumbling foreign faction, had dissected its flaws in less than a month. He stepped into her line of sight, his presence looming and dark. "Most brides spend their time picking out new drapes, Lina. You spend yours calculating my vulnerabilities. Why?" She finally turned, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight like obsidian. There was no warmth in them, only a cold, analytical depth. I don't look for vulnerabilities to exploit them, Hyun-woo. I look for them because in the world I come from, what you don't see is what kills you. He reached out, his hand gripping the railing inches from hers, the air between them thick with unspoken threats and a growing, dangerous curiosity. For a fleeting second, he saw it. The mask slipped, and he glimpsed the survivor beneath the bride. She wasn't just a quiet shadow in his house. She was a sentinel, a woman whose eyes saw the ghosts of every threat he had ever faced, and perhaps a few he hadn't even imagined yet. He had married her to secure a border, but as she walked back into the warmth of the house without another word, he wondered if he had actually brought home the only person who could see the storm coming before it broke. The gala held at the Seoul Grand Theater was supposed to be the public confirmation of the new alliance, a high-stakes parade of power designed to signal to the world that the Jang and Hart factions were untouchable. Hyun-woo walked through the atrium with Lina on his arm, her black evening gown shimmering like oil on water. To the photographers, they were a picture of intimidating perfection, but Hyun-woo could feel the coiled tension in the woman beside him. She wasn't enjoying the music. She was listening for the discord. The transition from elegance to slaughter happened in a heartbeat. As they moved toward the VIP elevator, the heavy glass doors of the entrance shattered inward. The air, previously filled with soft violin music, was suddenly shredded by the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire. Hyun-woo's instincts kicked in instantly. He reached for the handgun tucked into his small of back, stepping in front of Lina to shield her with his larger frame. But before he could even clear leather, a hand like a vice gripped his shoulder and yanked him backward with a force that defied her slender build. "Get down," Lina hissed, her voice no longer a melodic whisper but a commander's strike. In one fluid motion, she didn't hide, she intercepted. As the first assassin lunged forward with a serrated blade, Lina moved with a frightening geometric precision. She didn't use a gun. Instead, she used the weight of the man's own momentum against him, a blur of black silk and lethal intent. With a sickening crack, she redirected his strike into his own teammate and, in a flash of silver, disarmed a second attacker before he could pull the trigger. Hyun-woo watched, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. This wasn't the frantic self-defense of a scared bride. This was the highly refined combat of a professional, someone trained in the dark arts of close-quarters assassination. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, her strikes landing on pressure points and joints with a surgical accuracy that left men twice her size crumpled on the marble floor. When the final attacker was pinned against a pillar, Lina's fingers were buried deep in the soft tissue of his throat, her expression devoid of fear, adrenaline, or even anger. She looked bored. She looked like she was performing a routine task. As his security team finally swarmed the room to secure the perimeter, Lina stepped back, smoothing the front of her gown as if she had merely tripped. She turned to Hyun-woo, her breathing perfectly level, not a single hair out of place despite the carnage surrounding them. "You're bleeding," she noted, pointing to a small graze on his cheek. Hyun-woo didn't look at the wound. He looked at the stranger he had married, the woman who had just saved his life with the skills of a high-level operative. The questions he had were no longer about her loyalty, but about her identity. He had married a mystery, but as the sirens began to wail in the distance, he realized he had invited a war machine into his home. The silence of the Jang estate had changed. It was no longer the quiet of a sanctuary, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vault containing a live bomb. Hyun-woo sat in his private study, the only illumination coming from the blue-tinged glow of 3 encrypted monitors. He had built his empire on information, but for the first time, his vast network of informants and digital ghosts was returning nothing but empty echoes. He had commissioned a deep-dive investigation into the Hart family lineage, expecting to find a struggling foreign syndicate looking for a payday. Instead, he found a graveyard of deleted records and scrubbed identities. Lina Hart did not exist before 3 years ago. There were no childhood photos, no school transcripts, no digital footprint that suggested she had ever been a daughter of the Hart family. She was a ghost who had walked out of the shadows and straight into his wedding. A knock at the door, sharp and deliberate, made him lock the screens. Lina entered, carrying a tray of late-night coffee. She wore a simple silk robe, her face scrubbed clean of the gala's makeup, looking every bit the innocent bride. But Hyun-woo's eyes went straight to her wrists, noticing the faint, faded scars that looked suspiciously like they came from tactical restraints. "You're working late again," she said, placing the cup on his desk. She leaned over slightly, her gaze lingering a fraction too long on the darkened monitors. "The city is restless tonight. You should rest." "I find it hard to sleep when my house is full of strangers," Hyun-woo replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood up, closing the distance between them until he could see the slight dilation of her pupils. "I looked into the Hart's overseas holdings today, Lina. Funny thing, the villa where you supposedly grew up was sold to a private military contractor 10 years ago. It's been a training facility ever since." For a heartbeat, the warmth in her expression flickered. The wife vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating mask that mirrored his own. She didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand grazing the lapel of his robe in a gesture that was half caress, half threat. "Names and places are just stories we tell to keep the world from being afraid," she whispered. Her smile was haunting, beautiful, yet completely hollow. "You wanted an alliance to protect your borders, Hyun-woo. Does it matter where the shield was forged as long as it doesn't break?" As she turned and left the room, her silhouette disappearing into the darkness of the hallway, Hyun-woo realized the secret, promised in the headlines of his life, was far darker than a simple betrayal. He wasn't just married to a stranger. He was living with a weapon that had been carefully calibrated to mimic a human being. He pulled the monitor screens back to life, his eyes narrowing at a graining, low-resolution photo his team had just recovered from an old server in Eastern Europe. It showed a group of elite operatives in shadow, and though her face was obscured, he recognized the stance. He wasn't investigating a wife anymore. He was tracking an assassin who had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal why she had really been sent to Seoul. The fragile piece of the alliance didn't break with a bang. It began to erode with a whisper. Within the week, the atmosphere inside the Jang headquarters shifted from disciplined efficiency to a jagged, electric paranoia. Shipments of high-end tech destined for the Busan docks were being intercepted with surgical timing. Encrypted bank accounts, accessible only to Hyun-woo's inner circle, were showing microscopic drainage patterns, ghost transactions that suggested a traitor was siphoning the empire's lifeblood. Hyun-woo stood in the war room, his shadow cast long against a digital map of his territories. He didn't need a report to tell him what was happening. He could feel it in the way his lieutenants avoided his gaze, and in the sudden, inexplicable silence of his most reliable street-level informants. Someone was burning his house down from the inside, and they were using the chaos of the foreign alliance as a smokescreen. "The elders are meeting in secret," Min-ho, his most trusted advisor, muttered as he leaned against the heavy steel table. "They're saying the marriage was a mistake. They think you brought a Trojan horse into the heart of Seoul, Hyun-woo. They think the Hart family is behind the leaks." Hyun-woo's jaw tightened. "The Hart family doesn't have the clearance codes for the Busan shipment. Only my own blood does." As he spoke, the heavy doors of the war room slid open. Lina walked in, her presence as quiet and unsettling as a ghost. She wasn't dressed in the silk of a bride, but in a tactical black turtleneck and trousers, her hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot. She ignored Min-ho's suspicious glare and walked straight to the digital map, her finger tracing a line toward the northern district. "Your fourth-tier warehouse in Gangnam," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It will be hit within the hour, not by the Harts but by a splinter cell of your own security team." Min-ho straightened, his hand moving toward his holster. "How could you possibly know that?" Lina finally looked at him, her eyes cold and empty. "Because I've been tracking the radio frequencies they thought were private. Your men are amateurs at Betrayal. They're using the same encryption your father used 20 years ago." She turned her gaze to Hyun-woo. "The betrayal isn't coming from my world, Hyun-woo. It's coming from the men who sat at your wedding and toasted to your long life." The room plunged into a suffocating tension. Hyun-woo looked at his wife, the stranger, the weapon, the enigma, and then at his oldest friend. For the first time, the empire he had built felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. His enemies weren't just in the shadows anymore. They were breathing the same air he was. As the red alarm on the console began to wail, signaling the breach at the warehouse, Hyun-woo realized the war wasn't coming for his borders. It was already inside the gates, and the only person who seemed to see the blade before it struck was the woman he had been told to fear the most. The warehouse smoke still clung to Lina's hair as she stood in the center of Hyun-woo's study, the air between them vibrating with the silent frequency of a detonator about to click. Hyun-woo didn't turn around. On his desk lay the grainy photograph from Eastern Europe, now enhanced to reveal a terrifying clarity. It was a picture of a ghost, a young girl with Lina's eyes, standing among a group of child soldiers under the banner of the Vesper Syndicate, the very organization currently tearing his empire apart. The Vesper Syndicate doesn't leave survivors, and they certainly don't marry them off to rivals, Hyun-woo said, his voice a jagged edge of betrayal. He finally turned, his eyes burning with a dark, dangerous fire. You weren't just a bride from a failing family. You were their finest blade. You were sent here to gut the Jang Empire from the inside out. Lina didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't even move. She stood bathed in the pale moonlight, her expression finally shattering. For the first time, the unreadable mask fell away, revealing a depth of exhaustion that made her look fragile. I was their prisoner long before I was their blade, Hyun-woo. I wasn't sent to kill you. I was traded to you. She stepped into the light, pulling back the sleeve of her tactical jacket to reveal a series of tattooed numbers near her elbow, half hidden by a newer scar. The Harts didn't arrange this marriage to secure an alliance. They sold me to you because the Vesper Syndicate was coming to reclaim their property, and the Harts were too cowardly to fight them. They hoped you would be the shield that took the first blow. The revelation hit Hyun-woo with the force of a physical strike. She wasn't the assassin sent to destroy him. She was the defector who knew exactly how his enemies breathed, how they moved, and where they would strike next. The Vesper Syndicate wasn't just his enemy. They were her creators, and they were coming to take back the weapon they had forged in the dark. I sat at that altar knowing that every vow I took was a death warrant for both of us, Lina whispered, her voice trembling with a rare, raw honesty. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if you were any different from the men who branded me. I thought I would just wait for the end. Hyun-woo looked at the woman he had called a stranger, a liar, and a threat. He saw the scars she had hidden under silk and the loyalty she had shown in the face of certain death. The dangerous truth wasn't that she was his enemy, but that she was the only person in the world who truly understood the cost of survival. As the distant sound of helicopters began to throb against the night sky, the Vesper Syndicate arriving to claim their prize, Hyun-woo reached out and gripped her hand. It was no longer a contract. It was a declaration of war. The rhythmic thrum of the approaching Vesper helicopters vibrated through the floorboards, a reminder that time was a luxury they no longer possessed. Hyun-woo stood at the precipice of a choice that would either solidify his reign or end it in a spray of gunfire. He looked at Lina, really looked at her, seeing past the tactical gear and the lethal training to the woman who had spent her entire life as a pawn for men far less honorable than him. In the criminal underworld, trust was a currency more valuable than gold and twice as heavy to carry. Every instinct honed over a decade of betrayal screamed at him to distance himself, to cast her out and face the syndicate alone rather than risk a knife in the back at the height of the fire. But as he searched her gaze, he didn't see a sleeper agent waiting for a signal. He saw a reflection of his own weary soul, a survivor who was tired of running. My lieutenants are waiting for my order to escort you to the holding cells, Hyun-woo said, his voice echoing in the moonlit study. He stepped closer, the heat radiating from his body clashing with the chill of the room. They think you're the reason our walls are crumbling. If I stand by you, I risk a mutiny before the first bullet is even fired. Lina didn't plead. She didn't offer empty promises of devotion. She simply reached into the waistband of her trousers and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the master key to the Vesper Syndicate's communication relay. She held it out to him, her hand steady. If I wanted you dead, Hyun-woo, I wouldn't have saved you at the theater. I would have let the world think the Harts did it. Take this. Even if you lock me away, use it to save your people. Hyun-woo looked at the drive, then at the woman holding it. He realized then that the most dangerous thing about Lina Hart wasn't her ability to kill. It was her ability to make him believe in something other than cold calculations. He didn't take the drive. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand over hers, closing her fingers back around the device. "Keep it," he commanded, his baritone thick with a new, unwavering resolve. "You know their patterns better than any of my analysts. If we're going to survive the night, I need a partner, not a prisoner." The tension that had defined their marriage since the altar finally snapped, replaced by a terrifying electric clarity. By choosing to trust the stranger in his home, Hyun-woo had discarded the rules of the underworld. He turned toward the door, his silhouette broad and imposing. "Gear up, Lina. The Vesper Syndicate is coming to take back their weapon. Let's show them that she belongs to no one." Lina's shadow trailed behind him as they walked toward the armory, the silent bride finally replaced by the queen who would stand beside the king. The choice was made. She was no longer his greatest threat. She was the only ally who mattered. The assault on the Jang estate didn't come with a parley. It came with the thunder of breaching charges and the shattering of the Grand Conservatory's glass. The Vesper Syndicate moved like a shadow across the lawn, but they were no longer hunting a defenseless bride. They were walking into a coordinated web of fire designed by the two people who knew their tactics best. Hyun-woo and Lina moved through the darkened corridors of the mansion in perfect, lethal synchronization. There were no orders needed, no hesitations. When the first wave of Vesper operatives crested the stairs, Hyun-woo provided the suppressive cover, his heavy caliber rounds forcing them back, while Lina utilized the architectural blind spots she had mapped out weeks prior. She appeared from the ceiling vents like a vengeful spirit, her movements a blur of silver and shadow as she neutralized the flankers before they could realize the trap had closed. In the heat of the fire, the last remnants of the contract burned away. They fought not as a boss and his collateral, but as two halves of a singular, devastating force. When the Vesper commander, the man who had branded Lina years ago, finally breached the inner sanctum, he found them waiting. He expected to see Lina cowering or Hyun-woo negotiating. Instead, he saw a king and queen standing shoulder to shoulder, their gazes reflecting a unified, unbreakable resolve. The final confrontation was brief and decisive. As the smoke cleared and the silence of the Seoul dawn began to creep back into the bullet-riddled halls, the Vesper Syndicate lay in ruins, and the traitors within the Jang organization had been purged by the very stranger they had sought to underestimate. Hyun-woo stood in the wreckage of his study, his breathing heavy, his hand still gripped tightly around his weapon. He turned to Lina, whose black tactical gear was stained with the dust of the battle. She looked back at him, her eyes finally free of the haunting ghosts of her past. There was no more mystery between them. Only the raw, earned truth of survivors. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, moving with a tenderness that would have shocked the men who feared him. "The war is over, Lina," he whispered. "No," she replied, a genuine, radiant smile finally touching her lips as she leaned into his touch. "The war for survival is over. Our reign is just beginning." The sun rose over Seoul, casting a golden light over the estate. The world still saw a powerful Mafia boss and his mysterious foreign bride, but the truth was far more formidable. They were no longer strangers bound by paper and ink. They were an unbreakable partnership forged in fire and sealed in blood. The girl from the shadows had found her home, and the man who trusted no one had finally found the only person worth reigning beside. Together, they didn't just rule an empire, they owned the night.